Good morning. I'm Bob Schieffer, and this is a special expanded edition of Face the Nation.
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly.
Tuesday was an awful day for America. The president says he will bring those responsible to justice. But how? Today, we'll cover the story from every angle as we try to answer that question. We'll talk first with Secretary of State Colin Powell. Then we'll hear from New York Senators Hillary Rodham Clinton and Chuck Schumer. We'll talk with the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden, Alabama Senator Richard Shelby, and Nebraska Senator Chuck Hagel. Then we'll round it out with analysis from former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, former Air Force Chief of Staff General Ronald Fogelman, terrorism expert Judith Miller, stock market expert Ed Yardeni of Deutsche Bank, and as always, Gloria Borger will be here. But we start with Secretary of State Powell on Face the Nation.
Face the Nation with CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And now from CBS News in Washington, Bob Schieffer.
And as we begin this expanded broadcast this morning, we want to bring you up to date on the latest developments. President Bush has told the military, get ready for war. The vice president says, if you provide sanctuary to terrorists, you face full wrath of the United States of America. And Pakistan has told the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden. Secretary of State Powell is here. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for
coming.
Morning,
Bob. Gloria.
Let me start with this report from Pakistan this morning, where the government, I understand it, has told the Taliban that they're going to send a delegation to Afghanistan, and they have told them to hand over Osama bin Laden. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I've seen that report. I can't confirm it through our embassy yet in Islamabad, but if it is an accurate report, then I'm encouraged that the Pakistanis continue to play such a positive role in moving this campaign forward against those who might have been responsible for the tragedies of the 11th of September.
Well, isn't that a little odd that if in fact this report is true, that the U.S. government doesn't have any information about it yet?
I can assure you we're working hard to confirm it, but it is a press report at the moment, and we'll be confirming it in the course of the day with the Pakistani government.
Let me ask you, this obviously is what we want the Pakistanis to do, but by announcing this, as they have, is there another side to this, that perhaps they're telling Osama bin Laden, you better get out of town?
Well, I can't speculate in that. All I can say is that for the last several days, the Pakistani government has been very supportive and forthcoming. I spoke to President Musharraf several days ago, and he indicated full support. We provided them a list of things that we might be needing in the days ahead, and they said they would provide that support. We'll have to get into the details of it over time. And yesterday, President Bush spoke to President Musharraf and got the same kind of assurances. So we're very pleased with the role that the Pakistani government is playing.
Was this, in fact, one of the things we asked them to do?
We asked them for a variety of things, and I think it's best that we keep those between the two governments at this time until we have an opportunity to see their reaction, and then it'll all become public.
Let me just add one more question to this. If the Pakistanis did get Osama bin Laden, what would we want them to do with him?
Oh, I can think of many things, but I think let's wait and see if they do get him. I hope that they will, if they do get him and he is available in a way that would allow justice to be served, then I would want to see justice served. There are all sorts of UN resolutions and other statements out there, other requirements out there to bring this kind of terrorist to justice, to get it to stop, get terrorism to stop, bring these sorts of people to justice.
A war tribunal?
Well, we'll see. It remains to be seen what charges can be placed against them and what Pakistani law might be, and what Pakistan would do if they get this individual under their custody. But let's not over-speculate before anything has really happened.
Mr. Secretary, you have told Americans to be prepared for war. The President has. What will this war look like?
It'll be a campaign. It'll be an integrated, comprehensive campaign. We're not fighting an enemy that is located on a battlefield where we all can see the enemy and just go after him. This is an enemy that intends to remain hidden. It's a very resourceful enemy. And so we have to attack on all fronts, and we have to do it with a broad coalition because this enemy is spread out across the world, and it will take the international community. It will require intelligence actions, legal actions, financial actions, military actions, diplomatic and political actions, all part of a comprehensive campaign, not to go after just one person, but to go after a network, the Al-Qaeda network, and to go after other terrorist organizations that are practicing this kind of evil upon the civilized world.
Explain what the Al-Qaeda network is.
Consider Al-Qaeda as something of a large holding company, and the head of that holding company is Osama bin Laden. And within that holding company, you have got groups of terrorist organizations that are located in countries throughout the world that are loosely and sometimes tightly knit into Osama bin Laden. But there's no doubt that the support for all of them and the central nervous system for all of them flows up what is called Al-Qaeda, and at the top of Al-Qaeda is Osama bin Laden.
Should Americans be prepared to send ground troops?
We should be prepared to do whatever is necessary to deal with this threat. We are at war, the president said. But let's not speculate on what particular type of military response might be required.
Well, should we be prepared to kill civilians in this process?
You don't want to kill innocent civilians, but if civilians are terrorists, then they have made themselves the object of our wrath, as the president and vice president have said.
You have already said, or we already know, that the reserves are being called up. Do you think that under any conceivable circumstances it would be a reinstitution of the draft?
I don't see any need for that right now. The armed forces are strong, and with our very, very capable and loyal and so patriotic reserve forces, I think we probably have enough without considering reinstitution of the draft.
You have been focused in recent days in putting together this coalition. How's that going? Who's in it and who's not in it yet?
It's going very well. I'm just deeply grateful for the responses we have received, whether it was NATO invoking Article 5, the mutual defense article of the NATO treaty, the Washington Treaty, or the United Nations passing a very strong resolution both in the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Organization of Islamic Conferences making positive statements, the Organization of American States making a statement and now getting ready to have a meeting in Washington to take further action. I've been very pleased. On a bilateral basis, so many of our friends and allies have come forward, whether it's Israel, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Japan, Australia. I don't want to offend anybody by leading them out, but just about every country has come forward with a few exceptions. One, of course, is Iraq, and we wouldn't expect it to come forward. It is that kind of regime that causes so much trouble in the world. And there are one or two others that have not yet been heard from, but we've heard from such nations as Syria, for example, which we have always said is a state that sponsors terrorism, but they provided a rather forthcoming statement, and perhaps there are new opportunities with respect to Syria, not just going after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, but perhaps also dealing with other terrorist organizations that they have been supporting in the past. Let's see if they recognize that terrorism does not belong in a civilized world.
Is it because they now see the Taliban as a threat to their regime?
I hope they see terrorism as a threat to the entire world. But I'm not under any illusions about the nature of the Syrian government. But let's see if there is an opportunity here to work together on the elimination of terrorism as a cause of violence in the Middle East and everywhere else around the world.
Is it in fact true that we have made approaches to the government of Iran for help on that?
Iran made a rather positive statement for Iran. We have serious differences with the government of Iran because of their support of terrorism. But they have made a statement, and it seems to me a statement that is worth exploring to see whether or not they now recognize that this is a curse in the face of the earth. And of course, Iran has always had difficulty with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
On the other hand, Saddam Hussein of Iraq did not make a positive response to this. In fact, he said the American cowboy is reaping the fruits of its crimes against humanity.
This is an irrelevant individual sitting there with a broken regime. He pursues weapons of mass destruction. He is the greatest threat in that region because he refuses to abide by the simplest standards of civilized behavior. So we'll continue to contain Saddam Hussein. We will keep his regime under sanctions, and we will do what is necessary when it becomes necessary and when we choose to.
Any Saddam Hussein fingerprints on
At
this
the
particular
moment, we see
attack?
no fingerprints between Iraq and what happened last Tuesday, but we are looking. We will pull it up by its roots. We will find out who is responsible, and we will determine what connections exist between various regimes around the world who
There are-
participate in this kind of thing.
There are reports this morning that some of these people who were on these airplanes, in fact, may have gotten training from the U.S. military. Now, we know that people don't just wander off the street and get enrolled in U.S. military programs. Those are government-to-government exchanges. First, I would ask you, is that true? And the second thing I would say, does this increase the possibility that perhaps this is some sort of state-sponsored terrorism?
I'm familiar with the report, and I'd rather let the FBI and the Justice Department answer it precisely, but keep in mind that as a result of our relations with a number of countries, friendly countries, over many years, we have trained pilots for other countries in our training facilities, so that is possible, but it doesn't necessarily reflect state-sponsored terrorism. It just means that we trained somebody who subsequently moved in that direction, unfortunately, but he did get training in the United States, just as we know that the others were trained for the most part here in the United States in aviation schools.
When you consider some kind of a first strike in this war, what do you worry about in terms of retaliation against this country? That's got to be part of your calculation.
I assume that there are those out there who are still planning activities against the United States, whether we retaliate or not. We should not see this just in terms of retaliation for the sake of retaliation, just to strike for the sake of striking. We should see it in terms of a campaign that goes after not just retaliatory satisfaction, but goes after eliminating this threat by ripping it up, by going after its finances, by going after its infrastructure, by making sure we're applying all the intelligence assets we can to finding out what they may be up to. The measure of success at the end of the day will be no more attacks like this or of any other nature against the United States and our interest around the world.
We had never had anything like this, so perhaps that's one of the reasons for it. But clearly it seems that the United States was unprepared for an attack on the homeland. We're told now that even after people at the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, even after it was known that there were aircraft heading toward the Pentagon, that the Secretary of Defense didn't know that. The jets were scrambled, but everything happened too late. How prepared were we?
I think we all understand that Homeland Defense is an important mission and one that will be getting a lot of attention. The Vice President is personally directing our efforts with respect to Homeland Defense. I think it is a little unfair to say that the Pentagon was unprepared when suddenly a plane, an American commercial airliner, shows up in airspace just a few minutes away from impact from the Pentagon and say, well, why weren't F-16s up there ready or F-15s up there ready to shoot it down? Nobody would have anticipated that kind of threat without some sort of cueing or warning that such an attack was on the way, or we had some kind of intelligence that such attack was coming. So I think it's a little unreasonable and frankly unfair to suggest that the Pentagon was at fault and our military was at fault because we weren't prepared to shoot down an American airliner full of Americans just because it happened to be in the wrong air corridor.
Just speaking of increasing security, I'm told just while you were talking that David Martin, our correspondent at the Pentagon, reports that we have begun to increase security around America's nuclear stockpile.
I yield to David Martin, who's an excellent reporter.
Are you worried about biological and chemical retaliation?
I think we have to be worried about any of these threats: chemical, biological, radiological. I think this is going to require a full court response on the part of the American government, the American people, state and local governments, to prepare ourselves for whatever eventuality might be out there. We can't dismiss that possibility. But at the same time, remember, this was a fairly unsophisticated weapon when you think of it. The planning that went into it was very, very sophisticated, but they found a way to create a bomb using an airplane loaded with fuel.
Let me go back, and I want to talk a little bit about Pakistan here, because the thought occurs to me that we have asked the Pakistani government to do certain things. There's no question that they have these Islamic fundamentalists in Pakistan, and that government could well topple as a result of nothing more than the United States asking them to help on this. Joe Biden, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, says that is simply a risk we have to take. But the other part that I think about, and I must say worry about, is that Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Are we running the risk here of having a government take over in Pakistan that would be able to, as it were, have its finger on a nuclear button?
We are very sensitive to that, and I know that President Musharraf is very sensitive to that. So in our conversations with the Pakistani government in the days and weeks ahead, we will be mindful that they have internal problems that they're dealing with. But that was part of his calculation as he and his senior advisors and military leaders sat down and examined this earlier in the week. And they came to the judgment that even with the difficulty it might cause them internally, this was such a problem, such a crisis, and the need to show solidarity with America and to help the rest of the civilized world, that was so important that they were willing to take risks, and I compliment them for that.
Do you trust the Pakistanis?
Well, I don't see any reason not to trust the Pakistanis. So far, they have been forthcoming. They have given assurances to me. They have given assurances to the president, and we will see now what they are actually are going to do when specific requests are put before them. We have had a strong relationship with Pakistan for many, many years. We've been friends of Pakistan and the Pakistani people for many, many years, and I hope that friendship will continue and the relationship will grow.
Mr. Secretary, the last time you were on this broadcast, the Chinese were holding American airmen captives after the forcing down of the reconnaissance plane. And the first question I asked you that morning was, what is your message to the Chinese? I asked you the same question this morning because if I remember that message, what you said was later put on Chinese television, and after that the crisis broke and the men were eventually briefed. I would ask you this morning, what is your message to the terrorists? What is your message to the American people?
My message to the terrorists is that you don't know what you've gotten yourselves into. You have pulled America together in a time of tragedy. You will now see what we're made of. You'll see the steel that holds up this country. You'll see our determination. You'll see our firmness. And you will realize you are at war with a powerful adversary who will defeat you. And we will do what is necessary. We will use all the instruments of power available to us. Domestic power with the strength of our society and protecting ourselves domestically, internationally with our diplomatic efforts, our military efforts, intelligence, law enforcement. You're going to see the full weight of the American government, the American people brought to bear against this kind of activity. To the American people, I would say we have a tragedy that we will get through. It is so reassuring to see the American flags out again, to see the pride that exists within our country, to see our country coming together. It shows who we are and what we are. And I would say to the American people, we will prevail.
Secretary of State Colin Powell, thank you so much. When we come back in a moment, we'll talk with New York Senators Hillary Clinton and Charles Schumer in a minute.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The president on Friday at the site of the World Trade Center crash. We want to go back to that very place right now. CBS News' Byron Pitts is standing by. Byron, you've been on that scene all of this week. I don't know when you've been sleeping. Every time I turn on television, you're there. What's the latest?
Well, Bob, at about 4 o'clock this morning, rescue teams heard what they thought was a tapping sound coming from the debris. They went to that spot, they searched, but so far, nothing. Take a look at the images from ground zero as I give you the cold, hard numbers. The latest figures at this point, they have recovered the bodies of 159 people. 99 victims have been identified. 4,972 people still missing. In the midst of the debris and the bucket brigades and the heavy equipment, reminders this disaster scene is also a crime scene. Rescue teams have recovered what appeared to be the remains of passengers from one of the planes, still buckled in their seats. The body of one of the flight attendants, her hands bound. Just a few blocks away from the disaster site, rescue teams, investigators recovered the passport of one of the hijackers. And Bob, we've been told the FBI could begin a grid-by-grid search today of this 16-acre site in search of more evidence.
Byron Pitts. Thank you, Byron. And stand by. We may come back to you as developments warrant there on the scene. With us now from our studios in New York, Senator Chuck Schumer and Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. Senator Schumer, how long do you think it's going to take to get this repaired? It's just astonishing. I mean, people are talking about a new Marshall Plan to rebuild Lower Manhattan. But as I just watched Byron this morning, you realize what an enormous task this is.
It is a huge, huge task. There's so much. Just yesterday I heard that many of our subway lines can't run because they were either cracked or flooded or suffered structural damage. Our electricity grid system, which is so interconnected in New York, has trouble. The telephone system. And then the rebuilding is just enormous. We have lost, Bob, 30 million square feet of office space. That's the equivalent of 150,000 job places, places for people to work. It is a huge, huge task. The one good thing I would say, New Yorkers are amazingly resilient. The scenes that we have seen, Hillary and I have seen as we go throughout the city, are just amazing. Both the grief that is shared by everybody. I just went back to my local neighborhood yesterday. I spent some time. I found that the local school, 4 kids have parents missing. The local firehouse, 11 missing. Every street has somebody missing. But at the same time, we are so dedicated to building our city back, the city we love, the world city, the international city, and we will. But it's going to take a while, and it's going to take a lot of money, and we're so grateful that President Bush and the Senate and House, both parties united and really are helping us 100%. There's been no stinting.
And I know both of you, Senator Clinton, had your own turmoil and angst because, as I understand it, Senator Clinton, you did not know for several hours where Chelsea was. Senator Schumer did not know where some of his children were.
That's right.
Well, that's right, Bob. You know, from the moment we heard about it, the first plane going into the tower, you know, I called Chuck. He was trying to find out where his daughters and his wife were. Of course, his wife has responsibility for transportation in the city. I knew that my daughter was staying with good friends in the city, and I was desperately trying to find her, and it took some time to track her down. She was actually quite close to where this disaster occurred. I don't think you'll find anybody who doesn't have a personal story, and I've been so struck by how everyone is doing their best to help each other cope with what the after effects of this disaster are here in the city, and it goes far beyond the city. We have, you know, many people who came into work from the suburbs, from New Jersey, from Connecticut. We now know, and I was at the Armory yesterday visiting with the families who are still desperately looking for their lost loved ones, that this affected every single kind of person you can imagine. American citizens, citizens from all over the world. And, you know, I just can't thank America enough. Chuck and I came down with the governor and the mayor and saw the disaster firsthand on Wednesday afternoon and went to a briefing where the mayor and the governor told us exactly what was happening, and we could hear with our own ears that the immensity of this requires a national response, and I'm so grateful that the President, the administration, and our colleagues in Congress have responded. It's going to take a long time. Just as our war against terrorism is a long-term effort, what we need to do to help rebuild lives and rebuild our city is also a long-term commitment, and we're grateful for the help.
Senator,
I heard today that in Virginia, all the newspapers had full-page ads saying, "We love New York." That means so much to New Yorkers, and all of America has just been just wonderful to us.
Senator Schumer, as New York looks towards the future and towards rebuilding, should New York rebuild the World Trade Center?
Well, that's a debate that's going on right now. I think we should. I think that it doesn't have to be exactly the same way, but you know, Gloria, I look out at the skyline from my window of my house in Brooklyn, and I feel violated, looking and seeing how it has been changed by a madman on the other side of the globe and his henchmen. And to have nothing there, I think, would not be a good idea. So to rebuild in a way and to do it along with a memorial for those who were lost, I think that those who were lost would not want us to see that space lay vacant. And so there'll be a lot of discussion. Again, I think New Yorkers, we're known for having many opinions, but we'll come together on what will be the best thing to do. But my judgment would be we must build something grand there.
You know, both of you, I know, went to see the president after this happened. There had been $20 billion that people were talking about to rebuild and track down the terrorists. It's my understanding the two of you talked to the president, and almost immediately he said, we'll double it. Senator Clinton, tell us about that.
Well, Bob, when Chuck and I went to the briefing and realized that we needed to get relief immediately, we spoke with the governor and the mayor. They gave us a very rough estimate of about $20 billion that was really needed as a first installment to keep the rescue and rebuilding work and the human consequences of this. We have to rebuild lives. We have people who are without jobs as well as those who are now orphans and widows. And so the work before us is enormous, and we immediately called our colleagues, spoke with Senator Daschle, spoke with Senator Byrd and others. We know that we got great support from the mayor and the governor, who let the White House know that this was going to be a united front, and we're very grateful that we received the kind of bipartisan support. And when we went to see the president, we were sitting in the Oval Office, Chuck and I, the two senators from Virginia, and the president gave us a briefing about where we were in terms of our security issues. And then we asked him for the additional $20 billion over and above what he needed to conduct the kind of security, military, defense efforts. Yes.
Hold that thought for just a moment. I have to break in and say some of our viewers are going to be leaving us now, but for many of you around the country, we continue with our expanded coverage of this story on Face the Nation. We'll be back with Senator Clinton, Senator Schumer after this short break.
The healing, the investigation, the latest on the aftermath and of America Rising. This week on The Early Show with Bryant Gumbel and Jane Clayson.
And welcome back now to our expanded coverage on Face the Nation this morning. We're going to be on the air for the next hour as we continue to talk about this story from every angle. I want to bring you up to date on the very latest developments. Just a while ago, Secretary of State Powell said of terrorism, we will pull it out by its roots. We will find who is responsible. President Bush has told the military to get ready for war. The Vice President said Osama bin Laden is the target of the moment. I want to go back now to Senator Hillary Clinton and Senator Chuck Schumer, who are in New York. Senator Clinton, before we took that break, you were telling us about going back to the White House and talking to the president about the extra aid that was needed for New York. Tell us about what happened.
Well, Bob, as soon as we asked the president for the additional money, he said, you've got it. No hesitation. It was a wonderful affirmation of our commitment to doing whatever is necessary to rebuild lives as well as structures from this terrible, evil attack. And then we worked very hard with our colleagues, and we were overwhelmingly grateful for the vote that we received in the Senate and the House. This is the kind of commitment that New York needs, and which we are receiving from literally not the president, colleagues in Congress, but people on the streets all over America. We're getting all kinds of messages. My office is flooded with calls and emails from people who say, I've never been to New York, but I want to help. I want to know what I can do to help you. And we are just extraordinarily grateful. And it's going to be a long-term commitment, but we know we're going to have the hearts and hands of America behind us.
I just wanted to just say another word about the president, because he really helped this dramatically. You know, we made the pitch to him, and I said, Mr. President, we just need this $20 billion. And I thought he'd say, well, let's start off with 5. It's a huge sum of money. Let me give me a list. And instead, he just uttered 3 words. He said, you've got it. And I stood up. I was ready to hug him. I couldn't because he was president. But, you know, just speaking, we're
but
part
he was
of the,
rendered speechless.
I was speechless. And he said, you're speechless? And I said, for $20 billion, I can be speechless again. But he didn't have to do this. We're part of the blue states, you know. We're not part of his political sort of coalition. And the fact that he was so generous, and then late that night when some in the Senate didn't want to do it, He stood them down and said, we have to do this. It speaks for his ability to unify the nation. And Hillary and I are both just really grateful to him for his leadership and his help for New York, as we are to all of America.
All right. Senators, thank you so much. And I would say, Senator Schumer, there were a lot of people who were ready to hug a lot of people last week. At one point at the U.S. Capitol, I saw Trent Lott with his arm around Tom Daschle. You don't see that very often. Thank you both
Thank you
so much. We want to now check in with our correspondents at the key beats around town. We want to go first to David Martin. And David, I understand you have just learned that the United States has increased security around our nuclear arsenal.
That's right, Bob. This was ordered by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. Obviously, if someone were to crash a plane into a nuclear plant, that would be a major disaster, and this is the kind of threat that used to be unthinkable, but now is perceived in the wake of these attacks as a real and present danger. Although I need to stress here, Bob, I know of no specific intelligence that anybody is planning an attack on a nuclear plant. It is a general security precaution which is being taken in the wake of these attacks. One other thing that is changing almost by the hour, Bob, is this question of whether or not any of the hijackers attended U.S. military schools. What we know for sure right now is that some of the hijackers had the same names, probably 3 of the hijackers had the same names as foreign military personnel, mostly Saudi Arabian military personnel, who attended U.S. military schools. The question is, if the names are the same, are the people the same? And that is still being investigated. My latest information, and I can almost guarantee you that this is going to change, but my latest information is that yes, 2 of the hijackers attended Navy schools in Pensacola, Florida, and 1 of the hijackers attended an Air Force school. But in neither case is there an indication that they learned anything about flying airplanes. This is more language training and familiarization with the U.S. military, and it's more an indication of the degree to which these hijackers embedded themselves in American life before they committed this crime.
And David, let me just make sure I understand one thing you were saying. Are you saying that we've increased security around our nuclear power plants or around our nuclear arsenals? I think I said nuclear arsenals.
This was ordered by FEMA, so this is around nuclear power plants.
I think we should point out that those nuclear weapons are also always under fairly heavy guard, the heaviest guard that there is. Thank you very much, David. Let's go now to Jim Stewart. Jim, of course, has been tracking this story, the investigative side of it. He's our man at the FBI. Jim, what's new over there this morning?
Bob, the FBI is preparing to issue as many as 2 more additional material witness warrants this morning, bringing the total number of people in their custody who are believed to have direct knowledge of Tuesday's attack to 4. Additionally, the number of people for whom a red alert has gone out for questioning has now risen from 100 to 155. That list has been circulated to all the U.S. and foreign airline carriers, all the domestic police departments, as well as Customs, INS. And as for the 4 people who were named in the material witness warrant, it's not clear if they actually participated in planning the assaults, aborted their own attacks, or simply knew the individuals who were involved. They have not been charged with any crime as of this hour. Meanwhile, the FBI is scrambling this morning to explain its role in a search that began last month, approximately 2 to 3 weeks ago, for 2 of the men who later turned up among the dead hijackers. The CIA advised the FBI and the INS that these 2 men had entered the country. They apparently had been connected with the USS Cole. The INS confirmed they were here. The search centered in New York City. We're told several Marriott hotels were checked. But the question that's lingering at this moment is that if we knew their names 3 to 4 weeks ago, why were those names not on a checklist? How did they, in fact, manage to buy airline tickets in their own names? And finally, I would add to David Martin's report by simply saying that the FBI is carefully searching now not just the flight school records of those institutions in Florida where the hijackers received their training. They have gone to every other flight school in the country, and we are told now that that search for expertise and that people may have received at American universities is expanding hourly. Bob.
All right. Jim Stewart, and Jim, don't go away, because if there are late developments, I know you'll be standing by to bring them to us. Bob Orr, who covers the aviation beat for CBS News. Bob, you reported, I guess, on Friday that the decision had been made that if they could shoot down these planes, if they had been able to do it, they would have done it once they learned they were heading for the White House and the Pentagon. And I believe Vice President Cheney confirmed that this morning.
That's right, Bob. It would have been an extraordinary action. Because of the way that events unfolded, the government didn't have to make that firm decision. But we do know a little bit about the timeline. It was 8 minutes before the first jet hit the Trade Center in New York that the FAA notified the military command of the hijacking. Some fighters were scrambled out of Otis Air National Guard Base toward New York. They got there too late. Those two jets impacted the Trade Center. Later, of course, the Pentagon was hit. What you're looking at here is the Pennsylvania crash scene. And this was the plane that was of most concern. After the attack in New York and Washington, sources told us that a conference call was convened, including the White House Situation Room, military commanders, and also the FAA, to discuss what to do about this plane that was still flying blind to radar over western Pennsylvania. And we are told that a couple of F-16s were in the air, armed with air-to-air missiles, but got no closer than 60 miles to that plane before it crashed in that Pennsylvania crater. But make no mistake about it, according to authorities, the decision had been made that the U.S. government was willing to shoot down a commercial passenger jetliner if it had continued on to Washington. The quote that one source told us yesterday, we made the very difficult decision, we'd be willing to kill 100 to save 1,000. An extraordinary decision-making process. Obviously, it changed much differently, Bob.
All right. Bob Orr, thank you very much, Bob. All right, we're going to turn now to some people who have some other perspectives on all of this. In Philadelphia this morning, Senator Joe Biden. Senator Biden, of course, is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In our studio here in Washington, Senator Richard Shelby. Senator Shelby is the ranking Republican on the Intelligence Committee. And Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska, who is one of the key Republicans on the Foreign Relations Committee. Chairman Biden, let's begin with you. You heard Colin Powell this morning, who said, we're going to find these terrorists, we're going to root them out. Both he and the Vice President have said this morning, I believe it was the Vice President's words, Osama bin Laden is the target of the moment. But the Secretary of State made clear this morning that the government now looks on this as something much more than just the work of one terrorist. They're looking at a whole network. Can they take out a network like this? How would they go about doing it, and what's your evaluation?
Absolutely they can. The way to go about doing it is what they're doing. They're building a coalition. Remember, you and I, Bob, talked 2 days ago after I met with the intelligence head of the Pakistani intelligence service, and the question was, would they cooperate? They're going to cooperate. Not only are they going to cooperate, the Russians are going to cooperate. Everyone's going to cooperate for one reason, Bob. They've all figured out that national sovereignty is in jeopardy as a consequence of allowing these networks to expand, and they can only expand if they breathe the oxygen in the air that comes from the ability to hide or be involved with certain countries. And so it can be done. And the second point is, from my perspective, is we should not elevate this SOB to a level that exceeds what the American people are prepared to deal with. We have as many Americans prepared to give their lives as they have to give lives to do damage to us, number one. Number two, the idea that we are so vulnerable in the future that we can't handle it as Americans, I think is bizarre. We were prepared, and we have thought about, and we prepared for the possibility of an all-out war with a major nuclear power before. The American people can handle this. The administration's going about it the right way. It's going to take some time, and people are going to have to choose sides, just like the PACs had to.
Senator Hagel, do you worry about destabilizing Pakistan, destabilizing moderate Arab nations, and creating more terrorists?
Gloria, that is a very legitimate consideration. We are not at war with the Muslim world. Islam is not about this outrageous terrorism. We need to seek their support. We are getting their support. But this has to be handled carefully because we could unintentionally destabilize much of the Muslim world in the Middle East. I think we'll work our way along through this, but we have to be cautious, direct, clear, and understand something that Secretary Powell said this morning. This is an effort that's going to require all of the dynamics of our strength, economic, intelligence, military, everything, and an international coalition, as Senator Biden said. And bringing those forces together, harnessing those forces, we can do this, and we will win. There will be no mistake about that. We will win this. But your question, Gloria, is one of those dynamics that must be fed into the equation as to the delicateness of what we're doing here.
Senator Shelby, you and I talked Friday night about whether this was an intelligence failure, whether the hands of the intelligence community have been tied because of the restrictions we now have on recruiting agents. People have compared it to, they say, well, the FBI can go in and buy informants in the mafia, but the Central Intelligence Agency can't do that. What's going to happen here? What are we going to do?
I believe that's just one aspect of what we need to do in the intelligence community, and that is take the wraps off of the intelligence agents that are working around the world to try to get information to prevent these kind of terrorist attacks. Starting, I believe, in '95, the CIA started wrapping the hands and tying the hands by directives of what their agents could do and who they could deal with. We have to be honest with ourselves. We have to get down to where the people are. Are they unsavory? Are they down in the real dirt with people? Absolutely. Are they people you wouldn't want to invite to your home? Absolutely. But we have to deal with these people to get at the bottom of a lot of information we want, like terrorist cells.
Do you think that the head of Central Intelligence, Mr. Tennant, has done a good job? I asked you about this on Friday night, and you said, well, that's up to the president. I asked you, do you think he ought to resign? Do you think he ought to resign?
Well, that's up to him and the president, but I can tell you this was a massive intelligence failure. It happened on his watch. There have been a number of successes. A lot of them have been in the public domain, but there have been a lot of failures that are in the public domain, and I believe this was the biggest. If we didn't have a clue, Bob, that this was going to go on, something's wrong. If we had a clue and overlooked it some way, then something's worse. I believe myself that we need someone, head of the intelligence agencies, director of CIA, that's one agency, that has the stature of Donald Rumsfeld and the stature of Colin Powell, because intelligence is at the front line. Without it, we're just waiting around for the next attack.
Senator Biden, when Congress talks about appropriating money on military matters, it always talks about defining the mission. We need to know what the mission is. How do you see this mission, and when will you consider the mission accomplished?
I see this mission as dealing with first things first, the priorities first. I disagree with the thrust of what the specifics of what Senator Shelby said, but not the thrust of what he said. We have tied the hands of the intelligence community by denying them tens of millions of dollars that they should have had over the last 5-6 years. Actually, I think up to $200 million. We have also not done, and this is not recrimination, this is what we're going to have to do in the future. We're going to have to make sure that we do the things we know how to do relative to what the real threats are. The real threats are these kinds of threats, bioterror threats, chemical weapons threats, and we have to focus our money and our attention on those areas. We have to change some laws as well, Gloria. We had a terrorism bill that we introduced 4 years ago that allowed, for example, roving wiretaps, that allowed for tag-ins in certain materials. It wouldn't have affected or stopped any of this, but the point is we have to think more broadly about how we can infiltrate and deal with these organizations. And the third thing I think we have to do is we have to try to change our mindset here. Our mindset is not that we have to give up our civil liberties. Our mindset is we have to focus on allocating resources in the areas that we know. For example, senators, now our ambassador to Japan, Senator Baker, and Mr. Cutler came after and gave us a very thorough report on the amount of not loose nukes, but loose chemical weapons all over the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union and Russia, and they want help and they need help in corralling them. They said the price tag in that was $30 billion. That's an urgent priority. They have chemical weapons locked up in sheds with padlocks on them, with not enough guards on them, that have enough capability to do a lot more harm than was done here, and the harm here has been devastating. So I think this is going to refocus our attention on dealing with first things first. But the most important thing the President is doing, in my view, is forming this international coalition, not unlike what his father did in the Gulf. It's a more complicated, it's more difficult, but it was required in order for us to be able to get at these organizations, and it's going to take some time.
Senator Shelby.
I agree with Senator Biden on some of this. That is, I believe we have to restructure our whole intelligence system. But money alone will not do it. But money will be a factor in restructuring our intelligence agency. NSA is going deaf. That's one.
NSA is the agency that does the electronic eavesdropping.
And we're talking about a lot of money. I think we need to accelerate the modernization of NSA. That's one. But we've got to recruit some of the best and brightest of people to go into the CIA to become agents. We have a rich pool of people in this country. We are a nation of diversity. We need people with the best language skills, Arabic, Farsi, Chinese, you name it. We've got to do better than we're doing. Otherwise, we're going to have another huge intelligence failure, and we'll pay for it.
What should we be prepared for, Senator Hagel? These airplane attacks using airliners as flying bombs, certainly that was effective. Should we be prepared to expect more of that or something beyond that?
Bob, this is an asymmetrical threat. Terrorism strikes where we are most vulnerable, where we least suspect it. There is no isolation of threat here. It could come, as Senator Biden said, and we had hearings on this just a week ago, through biological, chemical, nuclear means, just as we were stunned by the Tuesday means of delivering a terrible terrorist blow. We must be prepared for everything. That means an alert nation, an alert intelligence community, military, laws, review of everything. So I understand Attorney General Ashcroft is sending a package to the Congress next week to begin to look at this review that we must get at. Immediacy of the crisis we are dealing with, and we must deal with that, but it is really the long-term challenge that we have, as the President has stated.
Bob, can I say one thing?
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't think we should frighten the American people, though, into thinking that there are a number of these incredibly wide-ranging, sophisticated cells and organizational structures like bin Laden has around the world. It's not like there are 5 or 6 or 7 other bin Ladens. There are a lot of isolated terrorist operations that do not have the reach or capacity that this operation did. So the likelihood of something like this happening quickly, I believe, is very, very remote. But the likelihood of the next phase of whenever this occurs, whether it's a day, a week, a month, or 10 years, is to deal with the places where we are not prepared. For example, we haven't even trained our first responders. Who are the people that went to the World Trade Towers? They were not the Army, they were not the Navy, they were not the Marines. They were the local fire department. These folks have not been trained, nor have we spent the billions of dollars necessary to equip them to be able to identify a pathogen, to equip them to be able to identify whether or not there is a smallpox that has been released, to equip them to know what to do with a chemical weapon release. Sam Nunn and I introduced a broad terrorism bill 5 years ago, and it was defeated because people were worried about posse comitatus. That's the law that says the military can't be involved in arrest. What happens if there were a nuclear scare? What happens to that? So my point is that there's a lot we can do, but the American people shouldn't be sitting there thinking that there is another large, wide-ranging organization that has been able to plan simultaneously some major nuclear or biological or chemical attack. But it's something we have to be concerned about down the road and allocate our resources to it.
Senator Hagel, should the American public expect all of this to take years?
Oh, I think we are in for a long-term commitment here. How many years? None of us can answer that, but yes, the answer to your question is yes. We need to understand this is a long-term commitment that the civilized world is going to have to make.
I agree with Senator Hagel. It has to be long-term. It can't be a quick response. That won't work, and it's going to take a big commitment of money and resolve. Resolve is it, and we've got to do it. Otherwise, we're waiting for the next attack.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for bringing
Thank you.
this perspective to us this morning. We'll continue with our expanded coverage on Face the Nation after this short break. And back with our expanded coverage of this extraordinary story, we have a new casualty figure from Mayor Rudy Giuliani in New York. Just a moment ago, he told reporters that the missing and dead, the total now is 5,097. To put that into some perspective, the largest one-day death toll in the history of the country was at the Battle of Antietam, when some 4,300 people were killed. Now we're told that Attorney General Ashcroft is coming in to have a news conference. Let's listen in a little.
During this past week, we've been dealing with the impact of an assault on the United States and civilized people of the world that has come from a pervasive and substantial terrorist network. It's a matter of the compound nature of the tragedy to understand that nations from Argentina to Zimbabwe, from A to Z, have lost hundreds of citizens in this tragedy. It illustrates for us that terrorism is the enemy of human civilization. Our effort is to develop all the information we can about terrorism, the terrorists and the terrorist networks that have inflicted this injury on the United States and this assault upon the people of the world, and to do everything we can to disrupt them and to put an end to their capacity. They have declared war on the United States with an act of war, and the President has very carefully noted that we consider it a responsibility to do everything within our power to those interests that threaten the United States and its interests to end their capacity to do so. Obviously, among the organizations that have that capacity and have previously been involved in assaults against the United States and its interests is the network of Osama bin Laden and his network. It is important to note that in recent months and years, a variety of terrorist organizations have cooperated in networking together, and that terrorism is an enemy to civilized people. We will be doing everything we can. We have launched the largest single investigation in the history of the United States. We have 4,000 active FBI agents pursuing a wide variety of tips and understandings and questions. We'll get to the bottom of this circumstance, but we'll also develop an understanding of how we can prevent further episodes, assaults on America and our people. It's clear to me that we need to upgrade and strengthen a number of laws in the United States. The Congress has very appropriately expressed its thorough willingness to provide for the President the resources that are appropriate in terms of finances to conduct this effort, and I believe they will cooperate to provide the enhanced law enforcement resources by way of authority. Let me indicate a few of the matters that I believe will be in a package that we will carry to the Hill, and ask members of the Congress to assist us in this effort by enacting authorizing legislation. I might add that I expect to be involved with members of the Congress on the Hill this afternoon in discussing these issues. In terms of upgrading and strengthening our capacity, let me say that we need to make sure that we have assigned a high priority to the fight against terrorism. There are areas of our laws and procedures which give us better tools against organized crime, against illegal gambling, for example, than we have against terrorists. We need to make sure that we provide the maximum capacity against terrorists in the United States. We need, for instance, to make it, to elevate the penalties for those who would harbor or assist terrorists to this, at least the same level as the penalties for those who would harbor or assist those who have been involved in espionage. And there are areas in which we need to just expand our capacity to surveil those involved in terrorist activities. Telephone surveillance has been limited historically to specific telephones rather than to people, so that if the telephone number changes out of its home area, or if a person ceases using one telephone and begins to use another telephone, we have to go back to court to get new authority. Now, most Americans, we all understand that you can buy disposable telephones now, use them for a limited period of time, and throw them away. And it simply doesn't make sense to have the surveillance authority associated with the hardware or with the phone instead of with the person or the terrorist. And we're going to ask Congress to help us with items like that. I'm grateful for the opportunity to go to the members of Congress, many of whom have called me and spoken to me during this last week and indicated that they are eager to provide a basis for us to address the new challenges.
So the Attorney General is outlining for members of the media what the Justice Department intends to do. He's talking about increasing the capability to have telephone surveillance. He is also talking about such things as increasing and raising the penalties for terrorists. But I think the important thing is he is underlining this morning, this is a much broader effort than just an effort to go after Osama bin Laden. As Secretary of State Powell said earlier today, as the Vice President said just a while ago, Osama bin Laden is the target of the moment, but this is a much broader effort aimed at a much broader network of terrorists. Jim Stewart is standing by with new information here. Jim?
Bob, the number of people who are now being held as a material witness is expected to double today. 2 men are already in custody. 2 more are going to be taken into custody, or if not already in custody, under material witness warrants later today. The number of people that a red alert is out for has increased from 100 to 155. And as a footnote, having listened here to the Attorney General just a moment ago, I can tell you that what they are truly contemplating is changing, in essence, the civil liberties as we know in this country, putting an asterisk, if you will, next to the Bill of Rights. They intend to expand the FISA court to do electronic surveillance. They intend to double or triple the size of the number of people that they use to surveil possible suspects. Bob.
All right, Jim. We want to go now to Islamabad, Pakistan. CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi has been there for the last 4 or 5 days. Of course, Alan, the stories reaching us here this morning are that the Pakistani government has served notice on the Taliban that they will go into Afghanistan in the next hours or days and will demand that Osama bin Laden be handed over. I say that, noting also that Secretary of State Powell said just a moment ago that the United States government has no real information on that. He has what he says, what he knows about it, he's seen in the press. What can you tell us about it?
Well, Bob, an official statement was made here by a government spokesman saying that, yes, a delegation from the Pakistani government would go to Kabul tomorrow to deliver what amounts to an ultimatum, I suppose, to the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden. But there have been developments in Kabul as well that affect that. Firstly, bin Laden once again denied that he had anything to do with it. He said in a statement released to the Afghan news agency that as a guest in Afghanistan, he had taken an oath not to engage in any kind of terrorist activities, although he didn't quite use the word terrorist activity. And the Taliban response to all of that is, well, we could not possibly hand over a guest in our country. But that, of course, begs the question, even if they did, who in their right mind would want him? Given Osama bin Laden's network, given his record, what country would want him? The feeling that we're getting here in Pakistan from people on the street is, you know, present hard evidence and give him to an Islamic court. The Afghan embassy here has said if proof was given to them and if an Islamic court then checked that proof, maybe they would then agree that bin Laden should be handed over. But there is no precedent for that sort of thing. We have, of course, the Lockerbie business where under Scottish law in Holland, the suspects from Libya were tried, but I frankly can't see that happening. And as I say, what country would actually want Osama bin Laden in it? And on that light, of course, Pakistan is lukewarm even about supporting the coalition effort against Osama bin Laden and against Afghanistan. We understand privately they're fully on board, but publicly they're going softly, softly. There were demonstrations today in Rawalpindi, the sister city of Islamabad. Very small, but albeit, but they do reflect an undercurrent of a pro-Islam, anti-American feeling here. Remember that America has put this country under sanctions for quite a few years, and the people that you're seeing in the streets on those pictures, they're poor, and they're blaming America for it. They say that, you know, they would have investment, they would have jobs, they would have aid money if it wasn't for the United States putting sanctions on them. Now, the people that you're looking at in those pictures are albeit hardliners. They belong to a group that funnels money to Osama bin Laden. Even so, they do reflect a problem that the Pakistanis have. And there's another problem too. Suppose America does come in here, as they say, and they put troops on the ground. They have to worry about protecting those troops. You may have to spend as much effort looking after any multinational forces here as you will going in after Osama bin Laden. You've got to remember that the Pakistani-Afghan border is wild, it's barbarous, it's mountainous, it leaks like a sieve. There are 5 actual designated passes, crossing points that are officially recognized from Afghanistan to Pakistan and back, but there are over 200 other known routes. They're used by smugglers, drug smugglers, smugglers of normal goods, people who make their living going back and forth. For centuries, nomads have gone back and forth across that border, not respecting, not knowing there's a border. So terrorists could infiltrate very easily from there. They could do anything they want. It's going to be a very big problem. We've been talking to defense analysts here who say, look, if you go into Afghanistan, you're not going up against a lightweight bunch. This is not going to be Desert Storm in to punch up the Iraqis who turned and ran. The Afghans fight. They fight hard. They're willing to die. And they say they'll die for Osama bin Laden. And at the moment, Bob, there's no reason to disbelieve that.
All right, Alan Pizzi with a very comprehensive report. Certainly this is a delicate situation. With us now to talk a little more about it, the former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, Middle East expert Judith Miller of the New York Times. And just to underline the delicacy of all of this, and Colin Powell referred to this morning, there is a large fundamentalist group in Pakistan which could well topple the government that's now in power. And what sets Pakistan apart from other countries where there are these large terrorist cells, they have nuclear weapons.
I think what we have tried to point out is that we have to be very careful in what we ask for publicly, especially what we are demanding that we release in terms of our public statements from the Pakistanis. Whatever private assurances they have given should, I think, remain that way. Otherwise, we're going to create a real serious situation for President Musharraf, which could, in fact, result in the toppling of his government. So we have to be careful. I think that's why Secretary Powell was so judicious in his comments today, and it should remain that way.
But the fact that they do have nuclear weapons, what is the security of those weapons? Could someone steal one of those weapons?
Well, they're under military security right now. To the extent that you have any kind of a coup toppling essentially a military government, President Musharraf was the former general in charge, now a president. But if the military in any way is compromised, if there is an element within it radicalized, that could in fact compromise the security.
Let me just
of
ask you while we're on this, because I wonder what sort of delivery systems do they have? I take it that Pakistan could not fire a missile that could get to the United States.
That's
but
correct.
They
do not have long-range capability at this point, but this is going to raise another element of the debate coming up in the Congress. There's already a question as to whether or not the fight against terrorism should come focus without regard to the National Missile Defense System. There'll be elements on Capitol Hill say, wait a minute, you could have another country who could emerge and then pose a threat in the future. So this debate is going to get fairly complicated and very intense.
Judy Miller, we've talked an awful lot about this morning about going in and getting Osama bin Laden. The Pakistanis may deliver an ultimatum to the Taliban. We're going to get Osama bin Laden. How hard is that?
I think it's enormously hard, and I think that's what Secretary Powell was explaining today, that this has got to be a long, sustained campaign. That Pakistani-Afghan border, 1,500 miles long, Alan Pizzey discussed it. These groups are deeply embedded in Afghan society. If you're going to, quote, smoke them out, as the president says, you're going to have to smoke them out of villas, compounds, caves, areas where they stage all over, and these guys are constantly on the move. This is not going to be easy.
Let me ask former Secretary of Defense Cohn here. Is this a job then for special forces, special operations?
I think the whole panoply of resources that we have at our disposal, military certainly, in terms of would involve bombers, B-2s, B-1s, would involve missiles, cruise missiles, would involve special forces. The whole panoply has to be available. Our covert operations, the CIA, but financial as well. And we ought to focus on this, because shutting down the financial support is going to be critical, not only for this, for Osama bin Laden, but for other operations as well.
You know, in line with that, what are we going to do? Apparently this is not being taken lightly. Here's a quote I was just handed. When the president met with New York and Virginia senators and others last week, he said, and we quote, this is the president talking, "I'm not going to fire a $2 million missile at a $10 tent and hit a camel in the butt. This is going to be decisive." The president means business here. But what happens after that, Judy? Because as you say, this is
But he may be required to fire missiles as well, as long as everyone understands it's not going to be a one-shot proposition. And he also has another problem, it seems to me, and there is a time frame that he has to operate: immediate, reasonably soon, and then long-term. If he doesn't take action reasonably soon, that will call into question on the part of some the leadership of the country. If he takes action precipitously, our allies may call into question the leadership. So it's a very delicate situation and decision he has to make. I'm satisfied they're approaching it the right way to date.
Judy, let me ask you, because you are an acknowledged expert on terrorism. Your new book is called Germs, I think, and it's about bio. But talk to me a little bit about the mindset of these people. Some people in America say these people are crazy. Are they crazy?
I've interviewed a lot of them, Bob, and they're not crazy, and we underestimate them when we call them crazy fanatics. They are fanatics, but they are rational fanatics, and they are educated. We've seen them now. They're pilots, they're engineers, they're taxi drivers. This group, these networks, use the range of people available to them, and they are very inventive at both recruiting new people and spotting the weaknesses in our system.
I'm interested in their financing. Where do they get their money? Where do they put their money? And why can't we stop them from getting this kind of financing?
Well, they raise money in a variety of ways. They raise money right here in this country through a number of so-called charitable organizations, religious organizations, some of which are legitimate, others which are not. And that money is then funneled back into their coffers. It's distributed in a way that makes it almost impossible to trace. This is going to require a great deal of technical information.
Where is it kept? In Swiss banks? Or?
In many banks. It's spread throughout the world. This is not simply sitting in one Swiss bank. If we knew it was sitting in one Swiss bank, we could take care of that. But this is distributed globally.
But Mr. Secretary, your administration had task forces in more than 20 cities in America, and yet we've seen almost no crackdown on the financial network and the structure. As far as I know, most of these groups are still operating. How can you explain that? Why were there no cases brought to stop this flow of money?
For the very difficulty we've talked about, you have many of the banks overseas provide for confidentiality which cannot be broken into. We're getting more and more cooperation from them now. I think now that they've seen the error of their ways in terms of protecting that information, they're going to be much more forthcoming. It's difficult to break into the financial system that's global now and not simply confined right here in the United States.
Let me ask both of you. We've seen these suicide attacks. Should we expect more of that, or is there something else coming?
I think we should expect more of that. This is not a isolated attack upon the United States. This has been long in the planning, and as Judy just mentioned, they're like predators. They will look for every weakness they can find. To the extent that we beef up security in the airports, as we should, they will look to other modes of transportation.
And also, we've seen in Osama bin Laden operations, there is oftentimes what we called in the paper today a 1-2 punch. There is one attack, and then there are plans for a second that follow fairly quickly after the first. We've seen that in a number of his operations, and I'm sure that's what one of the factors that led the FBI to close down many of the bridges and tunnels in New York and the airports for a while, because there has to be some concern about a follow-up attack.
I thought you made a very good point just a while ago, is how extremely sophisticated these people are. I mean, the planning that went into this, sleeper agents that have been in this country for years. I mean, the ability to buy airplane tickets on frequent flyer miles, which we now know that some of them did. I'm not sure we've seen anything quite like this in the past.
I never have, and I've been looking at this for 20 years, but you know, people learn from their mistakes, and that's what this organization is really good at.
If you were doing an FBI profile of an Osama bin Laden terrorist, what would it be?
Well, I tell you who it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be a woman. I've never seen a woman active in their ranks. We've never seen a leading female operative, which would lead me to think that maybe that's where they'll try and go next. But you get all ages, very young people, very old people, people who are middle class, people who are desperate and unemployed. It's hard to do these kinds of profiles.
Secretary Cohn, you heard this morning, and the Vice President also said that Saddam Hussein, so far as we know, was not involved in this particular terrorist attack. Would you, knowing what you know about Saddam, would you rule him out, however?
I wouldn't rule him out. This is not necessarily a pattern that he has followed in supporting terrorist actions abroad, so to speak. Is he capable of it? The answer is yes. Does he have the finances to do it? The answer is yes. It's not necessarily consistent with his past behavior, where he's launched his attacks mostly against the Kuwaitis and people, the Kurds within his own country. But I wouldn't rule it out at all.
Well, what do you expect from Saddam now?
Saddam is going to use this as a rallying cry against the West. He's going to try to stir the spirits of his followers to say that a major blow has been dealt to the evil Satan, and to try to shore up his own support within his country. I expect he'll try to exploit it for his own purposes.
Judy, what do you think the real possibilities are that the Taliban might give up Osama bin Laden? And do you think that the Pakistanis will make a real effort to go in there and tell them to give him up?
Those are both the key questions. The Pakistani government has told us before that they have asked for bin Laden. They have pressed their friends and allies and contacts in Afghanistan to please get rid of him, send him anywhere. There's never been any good results from that, but things have changed so dramatically now that I think people, surely they must understand that this is a very different situation. And I'm not certain that the Taliban at this point may not give him up, despite what they say about hospitality. The problem is they would have to give up more than him. He is surrounded by a group of people who are just as skilled, just as brutal as he. And that whole network, that whole group, what Secretary Powell called the holding company, has to be rolled up, and the camps have to be closed. I'm not sure they would do all that.
Now, what about what the Secretary said this morning about overtures to Iran? I asked him, I understand we're making overtures, and he said, well, we've already had some very positive statements of response from Iran. What could Iran possibly do here? How seriously do you take that, Mr. Secretary?
Well, it was unclear from the Secretary's statement whether we initiated the call to Iran or whether they volunteered it. They have a number of things that they're concerned about. Certainly, they would like, at least the moderates within Iran would like to have a better relationship with the United States. They do not want to be tagged with the same terrorist label that we are now looking at Afghanistan. They have, in fact, been supporting terrorist activities. They do provide support to the Hezbollah. They do support the unraveling of the Middle East peace processes. Their hand has been there. So this may be an effort of them on their part to say that we don't want to be associated with supporting terrorism, and now we'll offer whatever whatever support we can to prevent it from coming our way.
And we did get some help from Syria during the Gulf War. People forget that. Do you think we can expect help from Syria, Judy?
I think this is a new government, and it hasn't been tested yet. We won't know for a while what will happen. In terms of Iran, I think we must remember that they too share a border with Afghanistan. And the terrorism that they do, they like to control. They don't want someone else to control it. So I think they could actually be helpful. And in fact, there's some indications that they were already working with the Russians to help the Northern Alliance, which was fighting the Taliban. So I don't think you can rule it out.
And there was one concern, as a matter of fact, that if bin Laden were to leave Afghanistan, one of the countries he might have gone to would be Iran. And so they don't want him there either.
All right. Thank you both very much. We're going to turn now to another part of this very complicated and many-faceted story. What's going to happen on Wall Street? To talk about that a little bit now, economist Ed Yardeni of Deutsche Bank, one of the leading economists on Wall Street. Thank you for coming, sir. And I guess that's the question. What's going to happen tomorrow?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the New York Stock Exchange, the major exchanges are ready to open. They're ready to do business. There's I think a lot of people on Wall Street that just want to get back to work, back to business to show that the markets are operational. I also sense that we may be surprised that there would be almost a patriotic mood on Monday, people wanting to see the market going up. There are no guarantees when it comes to financial markets. But I think the important thing to realize is that we have already slipped into a recession, and usually that's a negative for the stock market, and stocks have been down. The likelihood is that this crisis will lead to a lot of government spending next year, and markets do look forward, and it's possible the market may actually start to recognize that there are things in place here that will give us a recovery next year, related to this unfortunate crisis, of course.
I find it remarkable that the market is going to be able to open. When you look at what happened, when you have one bond house that lost 700 people. I mean, this is a remarkable logistical feat just to get things back up and going tomorrow.
Well, it's been an enormous body blow to Wall Street. It's been the message was pretty clear that this was also intended as an attack on American capitalism, American financial markets. So as I said, there are people that have been scrambling very, very hard, very night and day to make sure that we send a message back that we're back in business. This is not to say there might not be some disruptions, but the reality is Wall Street's been preparing for a long time with backup systems, and I think you're going to see that working reasonably well on Monday.
Mr. Yardeni, the Vice President this morning said that the country, quote, quite possibly could be in recession. You just said that we are.
Well, actually, this past week we had some more economic indicators like industrial production, which were down dramatically in August. I think economists have been more and more moving into the camp that this is not just an economic slump, but it is a recession. So far, it looks like it's going to be a fairly mild one. But with this crisis, undoubtedly, you're going to see a lot of people, watching the news, cutting back on spending. It's going to worsen the recession through the end of the year. But again, I think that most economists also weren't quite sure how we were going to get out of this slump. Now it's very clear how that's going to happen.
Mr. Yardeni, how do you see the future of the airline industry right now? Will it go bankrupt?
I don't think so. I think they're very important to national business, and it's pretty clear to me that there's already some movements afoot in Congress to provide a subsidy to this very, very important industry. Clearly we can't afford as a nation to let terrorists shut down our system like this.
So you would support a bailout of this industry?
I think it's not a matter of a bailout. It's a matter of this is an emergency, a crisis, a terrorist attack on an industry that we desperately need to operate the economy. Another reason the economy may do better is that we will get the air system back in place. We need parts for our companies. Many of these parts are delivered by air. And so this is really part of our national defense. I can't see that we're going to let companies go bankrupt.
Well, of course, the Federal Reserve will be monitoring all this, and Chairman Greenspan. What options are open to Chairman Greenspan, and what can and should the Federal Reserve do here?
We're very, very fortunate to have fed Chairman Greenspan at this point. Here's a man with tremendous credibility during previous crises, and I think we're going to be very impressed by what the Fed will do. Already we should be impressed because the Fed has provided an enormous amount of liquidity last week, along with other central banks, to the banking system. And we've seen, for example, the Treasury bill rate, the 3-month Treasury bill rate is almost down to 2.5%. So the markets are anticipating that the Federal Reserve will in fact deliver at least a half-point cut in the federal funds rate very soon. They're scheduled to meet in early October. I would not be surprised, and I think the markets are anticipating there might actually be a cut on Monday.
And I want to go back to what you said at the very beginning. You think at this point, even in hard facts where money is involved, you think that for patriotic reasons, the market may stay up?
I just, look, all I can tell you is I've been calling around, talking to friends, and there is sort of an attitude of, you know, let's show them what we're made of. And I understand over the internet there's been some talk about, you know, buying rather than selling on this news. There's no guarantees, as I said, but I wouldn't be surprised if the market really shows its strength.
All right, Ed Yardeni, encouraging words, I must say. We're going to continue with our expanded coverage on Face the Nation this morning. After a short break, I'll be back with a final word. Finally today, Americans came together this week as they have not come together since World War II. You could see it and feel it, and not just in the calls for retaliation. I noticed it first as I was driving to the Capitol last week. The road rage of rush hour evaporated like a morning dew. Instead, flags flew from car phone antennas and drivers waved and gave a thumbs up when you signaled to change lanes. You could feel it at the Capitol. Congress passed a $40 billion emergency aid bill by an unprecedented unanimous vote. But that was only part of it. When Senate Republican leader Trent Lott and his Democratic counterpart Tom Daschle approached the microphones this time, Lott had his arm around and his hand on the shoulder of his old political foe. Someone said that America changed forever last week, but that is not quite right, because I am old enough to remember an America that used to be this way. That is the easy part for us to forget, because we got off track in the 60s. A great cynicism gripped the country after the death of John Kennedy, and as we became bogged down in Vietnam, a war we never understood, we lost faith in government, our institutions, and each other. But on Tuesday, we somehow remembered how it used to be, and how we used to understand that we were all in this together, that any one of us could have been on one of those planes, that our children or brothers or sisters could have been in one of those buildings, and that it could happen again. Many things happened on Tuesday, and I think one of them may be that we have finally gotten past Vietnam. Those who wanted to get America's attention got it, and they will rue the day they did. I want to thank our affiliates who allowed us this extra time on their schedule to bring us this very important story today, and we want to close now with some pictures that will tell the story of last week better than any words.